The sound came first, a thunderous crack of wood and flesh as the president's hand slammed against the polished table. Glasses rattled. Papers fluttered to the floor. And in that suffocating moment, the room of decorated generals froze as Donald Trump leaned forward, his voice sharpened to a threat. "I can have you demoted. Every single one of you. Don't forget who gives the orders here." For men who had stared down the battlefield's chaos, the words cut deeper than gunfire. Not because they feared rank, but because the weight of the commander-in-chief's fury carried something darker. A message that loyalty to one man could be valued above loyalty to the Constitution. The silence that followed was thick, almost physical, pressing down on every chest in that room. Eyes darted across the table, generals exchanging glances that spoke volumes but betrayed nothing. Trump sat back, smug in the hush he had summoned. To him it was dominance. To the others it was disbelief. These were not young cadets trembling before a drill sergeant. These were battle-tested leaders, guardians of American democracy, men and women who had sacrificed family, health, and peace of mind in the service of something bigger than themselves. And yet here, in this gilded chamber, they were being reduced to pawns in a game of ego. The air felt charged, the kind of moment where history holds its breath. Some in that room remembered the countless nights abroad, when the enemy pressed hardest and soldiers relied on each other's courage. But this time, the adversary was not across the ocean. He was standing at the head of the table, draped in power, demanding submission with the casual cruelty of a man testing the limits of fear. And then came the question that no one dared speak aloud, but every heart whispered. What happens when the commander-in-chief turns his wrath not on enemies abroad, but on the very generals sworn to defend America? The answer would not come immediately. It would unfold in whispers, in pushback, in a moment that would shake the room far more than any outburst. Because behind those stern military faces, beneath the rigid uniforms and steady gazes, a storm was building, a storm that had been brewing behind closed doors for months, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer hold. The summit had not been called for theatrics. It was supposed to be a gathering of the nation's highest-ranking military minds, a war council for the modern age. Around that table sat men and women who carried decades of service in their posture, the weight of fallen comrades in their silence. They came prepared to discuss global strategy, troop readiness, alliances strained thin by endless conflict. They came with folders of intelligence reports and sober ideas about how to keep America secure. But in one slam of the hand, the focus shifted. Policy gave way to personality. Strategy bent beneath the force of ego. What was supposed to be a deliberation on protecting a nation became a performance about protecting one man's pride. For the generals, the insult was not in the threat of demotion itself. Every soldier understands hierarchy, the possibility of reassignment, the chain of command. No, the insult was in the intent. This was not about discipline. It was about domination. And domination at the highest level of leadership is not just a matter of tone. It reverberates down every rank, every base, every family who sends their child into uniform. America's strength has never rested on one man. It has rested on the fragile but enduring trust between civilian leadership and the armed forces, between elected power and sworn duty. That trust has survived wars, scandals, even assassinations. But trust is brittle when it collides with arrogance. And in that room, for those who wore the uniform, the threat struck at something sacred. The idea that service to the nation should never be reduced to service to a personality. The stakes stretched far beyond the four walls of the summit chamber. If generals bowed to threats, what message would ripple through the ranks? That loyalty to the Constitution was negotiable? That honor could be stripped with a signature? Every soldier in the desert, every sailor on the seas, every airman in the skies, they relied on these leaders to make decisions guided by principle, not intimidation. And beyond the uniforms, ordinary Americans depended on those same leaders to remain steady. To know that when their sons and daughters were deployed, the decisions sending them abroad were made with wisdom, not whim. That when the weight of war pressed hardest, it was judgment, not anger, steering the course. Trump's words had threatened to shake that foundation. This was not simply a clash of personalities. It was a collision between two visions of America, one rooted in dignity, service, and sacrifice, the other in loyalty tests and vendettas. One side saw leadership as stewardship, the other as possession. And in that collision, the stakes became nothing less than the soul of American command. The silence after Trump's outburst was heavy because everyone in the room knew. Once those words were spoken, there was no taking them back. The question was no longer whether the generals could endure the threats. The question was whether America's institutions could, and as the silence stretched, another truth hovered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. This was not the first time Donald Trump had clashed with the Pentagon. The walls of the military establishment had already borne the scars of confrontation, and history, it seemed, was preparing to repeat itself, this time with consequences even more dramatic. Donald Trump never hid his fascination with power. From the first moment he stepped onto the political stage, he draped himself in the imagery of strength, towering parades, salutes, and the spectacle of soldiers lined in neat rows behind him. To his base, he projected dominance, a leader who would not bend, who would not be questioned. And yet beneath that projection was a recurring truth that the military establishment learned quickly. Trump's vision of strength was not rooted in service or sacrifice, but in obedience. He called them "my generals," as though four-star officers were not guardians of the Republic but pieces on his personal chessboard. The phrase carried a casual arrogance, as if decades of decorated service could be reduced to a possessive. It played well on stage, the crowd roaring as he gestured toward the men in uniform. But behind closed doors, the facade cracked. The same generals he praised one day, he belittled the next. The clash with General James Mattis became one of the earliest fissures. Mattis, revered for his battlefield wisdom and his near-mythic reputation as the warrior monk, believed in discipline, caution, and the careful use of force. Trump wanted theatrics. When Mattis counseled restraint, Trump mocked him as too slow. When Mattis urged alliances, Trump dismissed him as overrated. Their relationship crumbled not over policy disagreements alone, but because Mattis refused to play the role of sycophant. The moment Mattis resigned, Trump's tone shifted overnight. The man he once praised as a genius was suddenly the world's most overrated general. Then came General John Kelly, a Marine who had endured the unimaginable loss of a son in combat. For Kelly, service was sacred, not a slogan. But Trump viewed Kelly's discipline as suffocating, his advice as inconvenient. Their confrontations grew heated, with Kelly warning privately that Trump's impulses were dangerous. Soon, Kelly too was discarded, another casualty of a presidency that demanded loyalty to personality above principle. General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was perhaps the most symbolic clash. Trump paraded him in public, eager for the optics of a uniformed man standing by his side. But Milley, steeped in the tradition of civilian control of the military, resisted attempts to politicize the armed forces. Their most infamous conflict came after protests erupted in Washington, D.C. Trump wanted Milley in uniform as he marched across Lafayette Square, a staged show of force for the cameras. Milley complied in the moment, but afterward expressed deep regret, publicly apologizing to the nation and distancing himself from the political theater. Trump never forgave the slight. To him, Milley's apology was betrayal. To Milley, it was the preservation of an institution's dignity. Time and again, the pattern repeated. Trump demanded spectacle. The generals offered sober counsel. He wanted loyalty. They gave him truth. And when truth clashed with ego, Trump lashed out. He derided decorated veterans, mocked prisoners of war, and privately fumed about generals who refused to do what I tell them. His view of the military was not as a check on power, but as an extension of it, a tool to be wielded for optics and vengeance. The contradictions piled up like wreckage. On stage, he vowed unwavering support for the troops. Off stage, he dismissed fallen soldiers as suckers and losers. In public, he wrapped himself in the flag. In private, he spoke of generals with the tone of a man bargaining over contractors. To Trump, service was spectacle and sacrifice was secondary to loyalty. This was not leadership rooted in collective ethos. It was leadership twisted into a performance of dominance. The military, with its centuries-old traditions of shared duty, of honor before self, became a mirror against which Trump measured his reflection. And when that mirror showed him something less than absolute control, he shattered it with insults and threats. By the time of the military summit, these confrontations were no longer isolated. They formed a pattern etched deep into the memories of those seated around the table. They knew his temper, his disdain for contradiction, his obsession with hierarchy as a personal weapon. They had seen him praise a general one morning and humiliate the same man by nightfall. They had felt the sting of his derision when their counsel did not flatter him. And so, when Trump's hand slammed against the summit table and his threat echoed in the air, it did not come as a shock born of novelty. It came as the latest act in a drama they had lived before. But this time something felt different. This was no longer a private clash behind closed doors, no longer a war of words confined to whispers. This was a direct attempt to bend the institution itself to the will of one man. And in that gilded chamber, lined with stars and stripes, Donald Trump's need for dominance would collide with something he had underestimated time and again, a wall of silent resistance. To understand the men and women who sat across from Donald Trump that day, one must first understand what it means to live a life defined by service. These were not politicians measuring their words for applause or donors. They were soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who had risen through the ranks by virtue of sacrifice, steadiness, and the unbreakable belief that duty must always outweigh self. Their faces bore the quiet dignity of people who had seen the cost of war up close and carried it with them long after the battlefield was left behind. Take General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. His story was not one of privilege, but of persistence. The son of a Navy veteran who had fought at Iwo Jima, Milley grew up hearing tales of sacrifice that were not glamorous but gritty, the kind of stories that left a boy in awe of what ordinary Americans had endured to preserve the Republic. He carried that legacy into Princeton's ROTC program and later into the mud and dust of combat zones. For him, wearing the uniform was not about prestige. It was about living up to a lineage of sacrifice that had demanded more than it ever gave back. He was not alone. Around that table were men and women who had buried comrades, written letters to grieving families, and stood before flag-draped coffins knowing the decisions they made had consequences etched in stone. They had felt the sting of sandstorms in Iraq, the crushing fatigue of endless tours in Afghanistan, the suffocating pressure of command when every choice meant lives saved or lost. These experiences do not leave a person untouched. They carve into the soul a humility that cannot be faked, a gravity that no applause line can match. Behind every uniform was also a family, wives and husbands who endured the nights of uncertainty, children who learned to celebrate holidays with one empty seat at the table, parents who feared every phone call. For military leaders, the personal and professional were inseparable. Every salute, every briefing, every decision was tethered to that private sacrifice. It is why the oath they swore unto the Constitution, not to any individual, was more than words. It was a covenant sealed in blood and memory, and yet, despite all they had endured, they rarely demanded recognition. Their pride was quiet, expressed not in boasts, but in discipline. They did not seek the spotlight, nor did they hunger for applause. Their authority came from the silent respect of those who served under them, soldiers who would follow them into fire because they knew their leaders would never abandon them. That bond, forged in foxholes and command tents, in victory and in loss, was stronger than any political decree. When Trump threatened demotions, it was not merely an insult. It was an attempt to reduce lifetimes of service to bargaining chips. To a man like Milley, who had seen young privates give everything in places most Americans could not find on a map, such a threat was hollow compared to the sacrifices he had already borne witness to. You cannot intimidate someone who has stood among the fallen. You cannot diminish someone who has spent decades proving that dignity is earned not by rank, but by how one carries the weight of responsibility. There was also in that room the memory of oaths repeated through generations. Each of those generals had spoken the words, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The power of that oath was not abstract. It was the compass that had guided them through political winds, through unpopular wars, through administrations that came and went. Presidents are temporary. The Constitution is enduring. That knowledge gave them a quiet resilience in the face of Trump's anger. For all his bluster, Trump underestimated what sat across from him. Not just individuals, but embodiments of an ethos older than his own career, deeper than his own ambitions. Service before self, honor before ego, country before man. These were not slogans on a rally stage. They were principles tattooed on the soul of every leader in that room. And as the president's threat echoed, a shift occurred. Imperceptible to some, but undeniable to those who understood the language of silence. Backs straightened. Eyes steeled. The tension no longer belonged only to Trump's anger. It belonged to the unspoken defiance of men and women who would not be bent no matter the force applied. Their dignity was not loud, but it was immovable. Like stones shaped by centuries of wind, they had been weathered by wars, by losses, by the brutal lessons of command. To a man obsessed with dominance, this silence was infuriating. To those who recognized it, the silence was strength itself. And it was within that silence, heavy as a storm about to break, that history prepared its moment. Because in the very instant Trump tried to bend them to his will, one of them would rise with words that left the room frozen. The silence after Trump's threat stretched long enough to feel permanent. He mistook it for submission. Leaning forward, his voice sharpened into something colder. "You forget who put those stars on your shoulders. I can take them away just as easily. Loyalty is not optional. Loyalty is everything." Around the table, eyes shifted, not in fear but in calculation. These were not rookies facing their first trial of fire. They had survived ambushes, negotiated with tribal leaders, stared down insurgents who masked malice with smiles. They knew what it meant to stand steady when pressure mounted. Trump's words were loud, but their silence was louder still. Frustrated, he pressed harder. "I don't need excuses. I need obedience. The American people expect you to follow orders, not question them. When I say move, you move. When I say strike, you strike. If you can't handle that, I'll find someone who will." His voice rose until it nearly cracked. The fury of a man who had built his identity on dominance, yet found himself staring into a wall that would not bend. A general finally spoke. Carefully, evenly. "Mr. President, our oath is to the Constitution. Our duty is to provide you our best judgment, even when it's not what you want to hear." The words were respectful, but the meaning behind them was unmistakable. "We will not become your echo." Trump's eyes narrowed. He jabbed a finger toward the speaker, his tone dripping with menace. "Don't play games with me. I know disloyalty when I see it. Don't think you can hide behind uniforms and medals. I made you who you are. Without me, you're nothing." The room tightened, the temperature rising with each syllable. Another general shifted forward, his voice calm but firm. "With respect, sir, these uniforms were earned long before politics entered the room." It was not defiance shouted in anger, but truth delivered with steel. Trump bristled. "So you think you're smarter than me? You think the American people elected you? No, they elected me. And you will do what I say, or you will pay the price." He slammed his hand on the table again, the echo bouncing off walls lined with flags and portraits of leaders who had carried burdens far heavier than his ego. But the generals did not flinch. They had faced mortar fire and midnight raids. They had delivered orders knowing lives hung in the balance. A raised voice in a gilded chamber could not shake men and women tempered by the crucible of war. Their stillness was its own defiance, their restraint its own statement. The tension was unbearable, as if the room itself might fracture under the weight of two irreconcilable visions. Trump sought loyalty to him. They clung to loyalty to something higher. His temper boiled hotter with every second their eyes refused to cower. Finally, he leaned back, sneering. "You'll regret crossing me. You'll regret it more than you know." The threat lingered in the air like smoke. For a fleeting moment, he believed he had reasserted control, that fear had done its work. But control is fragile when it rests on intimidation. The general's silence was not surrender, it was patience. Beneath that calm exterior, the storm was gathering, steady and inevitable. And when the president thought he had silenced the room, the counterattack began. For a moment, the air hung thick with Trump's last threat, the echo of his words clinging to the paneled walls like smoke that refused to clear. He leaned back in his chair, lips pressed into a thin, triumphant line. He thought he had won. He thought fear had finally seeped into the cracks of the room. But then, a chair shifted. The sound was small, almost insignificant, yet it carried like the crack of a rifle in the silence. One of the generals, broad-shouldered, face weathered by decades of service, eyes carrying the burden of every soldier lost under his command, leaned forward. His hands folded on the table, steady as stone. He did not shout. He did not need to. "Mr. President," he began, his tone low, deliberate, each word chosen as carefully as if it were a command on the battlefield. "You misunderstand the source of our loyalty." Trump blinked, as if not quite believing someone had dared to break the silence in this way. His jaw twitched. "Excuse me?" The general met his gaze unflinchingly. "Our stars, our uniforms, our oaths, they are not yours to give, and they are not yours to take. They were earned long before you arrived in this office, and they will endure long after you leave it." A rustle swept through the room. Eyes widened. Hands tightened on pens. Some generals exchanged glances that carried both fear and relief, as though someone had finally said aloud what they all knew but dared not voice. Trump leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You're treading on thin ice, General," but the officer's calm was unbreakable. He paused, letting the silence press against Trump's fury until the imbalance became undeniable. Then he continued, "Our oath is not to a man, not to a party, not even to a single administration. Our oath is to the Constitution of the United States, to the people who trust us with their sons and daughters, to a country that survives not because of one leader's will, but because millions choose service above self." The words struck like artillery shells, not with volume, but with precision. Trump shifted in his seat, the bravado on his face flickering. For the first time that night, a crack appeared in his armor of confidence. Another general, emboldened, leaned in. "We give you counsel not to resist you, but to protect the lives of those who will pay the price if we are wrong. If we abandon that duty, sir, then the stars on our shoulders mean nothing." A murmur rippled across the table, a quiet chorus of assent without a word spoken. Trump's face reddened. "You think you can embarrass me?" "In front of my own people?" The first general did not waver. His eyes locked on Trump's, steady as a sniper's aim. "With respect, Mr. President, this is not about you. It never was. It is about the flag above us, the Constitution beneath us, and the men and women beside us. If we surrender that truth, then we dishonor every soldier who bled for this country." The room went still. Aides shifted uncomfortably at the edges of the table. One cleared his throat as if to cut the tension, then thought better of it. A colonel scribbled a note, though his hand shook just enough to betray his nerves. Trump tried to laugh it off, a short, bitter chuckle. "You're very dramatic. You sound like you're auditioning for television." The general didn't blink. He let the words fall away into the quiet before answering. "Dramatic, sir, is asking men to risk their lives for ego. Dramatic is treating service like theater. We deal in reality. And the reality is this: power is temporary. Duty is forever." The line cut through the air like a blade. Some officers looked down, hiding small, incredulous smiles. Others stared straight ahead, the weight of the moment pressing on their shoulders. For them, this wasn't entertainment. It was history unfolding in real time. Trump shifted again, his hand tapping nervously on the armrest. The tapping grew faster, louder, until he forced it still. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. For once, his tongue failed him. The general leaned back slowly, not with arrogance, but with the unshakable gravity of a man who had spoken truth and needed no echo. His silence now was as powerful as his words had been seconds earlier. Trump tried to recover. "You think the people will side with you? They want strength. They want loyalty." The general's reply was quiet, almost gentle. "Strength is not measured by how many bow to you. It's measured by how many stand when bowing would be easier. Loyalty is not demanded. It is earned. A pause followed, stretching long enough that even Trump's allies at the table began to avoid his eyes. One whispered to another, barely audible, "He's done." In that silence, the balance shifted. Trump was still president, still commander-in-chief, still sitting at the head of the table. But in that moment, authority belonged to the man who had spoken. Not because he sought it, but because he had embodied it. The general's final words landed like a gavel, closing the argument. "You may command the office, sir. But the soul of the military cannot be commanded. It is given freely through sacrifice, and that sacrifice will never belong to ego." It was the mic drop, the unanswerable line. Trump froze, his face a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. His allies fidgeted. Some aides lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet his gaze. Others darted quick, nervous looks toward the generals, as if realizing the tide had turned and they were witnessing the start of something irreversible. The weight of the statement settled over the room like heavy dust. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Nobody dared breathe too loud. And then, as though on cue, a dozen silent exchanges rippled across the table, glances filled with unspoken agreement, relief, even pride. The generals had not broken. They had not yielded. They had, in their own quiet way, stood taller than the president himself. Trump's mask cracked. The man who thrived on spectacle, who demanded loyalty above all else, had been struck by a weapon he could neither predict nor disarm, the calm authority of truth. He forced a smirk, but it looked brittle. He adjusted his tie as if rearranging the fabric could conceal the fracture beneath his surface. "We'll see about that," he muttered, too low for some at the far end of the table to catch. But the generals heard it. They always did, and though they gave no outward reaction, they knew the battle lines had been drawn in ways that could never be erased. The meeting limped forward after that, the agenda items reduced to hollow motions. Yet everyone in the room understood the real event had already occurred. The counterattack had been launched, not with weapons but with words. And in its aftermath, the president's authority no longer seemed untouchable. The generals sat straighter. Trump sat quieter. The aides scribbled notes that would one day read like pieces of a larger puzzle, because outside the closed doors of that summit, the ripple effects were already beginning. It didn't take long. Before the echoes of the summit had faded from the wood-paneled walls, whispers had already slipped through cracks in the door. By nightfall, fragments of the confrontation, the slam of Trump's hand, the general's unflinching words, began trickling into the bloodstream of Washington. By morning, it was everywhere. Cable news anchors spoke with barely concealed awe. "We're told the president threatened demotions," and a senior general looked him in the eye and said, "Power is temporary. Duty is forever." The line was repeated like scripture, dissected on every panel, replayed on loop with swelling graphics. Within hours, it wasn't just a quote. It was a rallying cry. Social media exploded. Hashtags surged to the top of trending lists. Duty over ego, stars not for sale, mic drop general. Memes flooded timelines. Trump rendered in caricature, red-faced and fuming, while a stoic general towered silently beside him. TikToks synced the story to dramatic music, edits cutting between archival battlefield footage and the alleged words spoken in that room. The internet had chosen its hero, and the clip, though unofficial, stitched together from whispers and insider leaks, became viral legend. Late-night hosts pounced. One grinned into the camera, shaking his head. "When your generals have better punchlines than your comedians, maybe it's time to stop threatening demotions." Laughter rolled through studios as impersonators mimicked Trump's bluster against the calm, granite-like delivery of his uniformed antagonist. But beyond the jokes, the fallout was serious. Trump's allies scrambled to contain the damage, dismissing the reports as exaggerated gossip and deep state smears. Yet their denial only sharpened suspicion. If nothing happened, why were they working so hard to discredit the story? Critics, meanwhile, seized the moment. Editorials thundered across major papers. A president who seeks loyalty, and a military that will not bend. Pundits framed the clash as emblematic of something larger, a battle for the soul of American democracy, where personal power collided head-on with institutional duty. At workplaces across the country, debates broke out in break rooms and coffee lines. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Can you imagine? Threatening generals like their interns? Others, loyal to Trump, argued it was strength misunderstood, a leader demanding control. But most hovered in a gray zone of unease, if even the military had to push back. What did that say about the state of leadership at the top? The cultural echo reached far beyond Washington. Military families took to Facebook, posting tributes to the unnamed general's words. "This is why my husband serves," one woman wrote beside a photo of her husband in fatigues, their children clinging to his legs. Veterans groups released statements applauding the reminder that the oath was to the Constitution, not a man. The phrase "duty is forever" appeared on T-shirts, bumper stickers, even hand-painted signs outside bases. The story became more than a political skirmish. It became a cultural mirror. It revealed the fractures in America's perception of power, the hunger for leaders who spoke not with rage but with principle. Every retweet, every late-night punchline, every whispered conversation in a diner added weight to the moment. And yet beneath the noise, the question lingered like an unhealed wound. Was this just another viral cycle destined to fade? Or was it the spark of something deeper? Because beyond the memes, beyond the hashtags, beyond the headlines that blared with manufactured certainty, a truth pressed harder into the nation's conscience. The deeper question remained, what does this say about power in America? In the quiet that followed the storm, one truth became undeniable. Arrogance fades, but dignity endures. The summit, meant to be a display of presidential dominance, had become something else entirely, a reminder that America's strength does not live in the clenched fist of a single man, but in the steady hands of those who refuse to bow when conscience is at stake. The generals had not needed to shout nor match fury with fury. Their power lay in restraint, in the calm certainty of their oath. They had sworn to defend a constitution, not to flatter an ego, and that difference, invisible to some, sacred to others, is what allowed them to stand unshaken while the commander-in-chief tried to bend them like twigs. History is filled with leaders who believed fear could buy loyalty. For a time, it often does. Fear can force silence, can tighten jaws and lower eyes, but fear is brittle. It cracks the moment it meets resolve. And in that room, resolve wore stars on its shoulders and the memory of sacrifice in its eyes. The lesson that emerged was larger than politics. It was a lesson about America itself. This nation has never been perfect, never free from struggle or strife. But its survival, through wars, depressions, assassinations, impeachments, has depended on one idea, that institutions must be stronger than individuals, and principles must be stronger than pride. What happened in that summit was not just a clash between a president and his generals. It was a collision between two visions of power. One saw leadership as possession, fragile, loud, and desperate to be obeyed. The other saw leadership as stewardship, humble, enduring, and bound to something greater than self. And in that collision, the lesson for every American became clear. Whether soldier or citizen, whether in uniform or in civilian life, our strength is not in who shouts the loudest, but in who holds firm when it matters most. Service and oath are heavier than threats. Dignity weighs more than intimidation, because leadership built on fear always crumbles. But leadership grounded in principle, no matter how quiet, no matter how patient, endures. As the story of that summit rippled outward, it did more than stir headlines or fuel memes. It planted a reminder deep in the national conscience. America is not one man. It is millions, bound by belief in something larger than themselves. And those who try to shrink it into an extension of their ego will always face the same fate, exposed, rattled, diminished by the very dignity they sought to break. In the end, dignity won that room. And dignity will always outlast arrogance. Trump threatened demotions at a military summit, but what he unleashed was something far greater than a moment of anger. He revealed for the entire nation to see the timeless truth about where real power lives. Not in a title, not in a threat, but in the men and women who stand their ground with dignity when arrogance tries to bend them. This story is not just about one meeting behind closed doors. It is about us, about what kind of leadership we demand, about the values we choose to lift higher than fear. Every time a leader believes intimidation can outlast principle, history delivers the same verdict. Arrogance fades, dignity endures. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe true leadership is built on fear or on service? Do you believe America's strength rests in loyalty to a man or loyalty to the Constitution? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because these conversations matter, and your voice is part of the story. And if you believe, as we do, that service should always stand taller than ego, then don't just watch. Join, subscribe, share this video, and be part of a movement that chooses dignity over arrogance, truth over bluster, principle over intimidation. Because this channel is not just about politics. It's about remembering who we are and who we still can be. Together, we can remind the world that the stars on a general's shoulders and the values in a citizen's heart shine brighter than any threat. This is more than a channel. This is a movement. And if you believe dignity will always outlast arrogance, you belong here.